My daughter recently approached Alan Lohaus of our congregation. If you don't know Alan, he is an accomplished doctor, retired now, and now an accomplished woodworker. And my daughter, Phoebe, who you saw this morning, she expressed her hopes for a tree house in the gnarly backyard pine tree behind our home. Yeah. At first glance, it's not an ideal spot for a hideout. And Mr. Allen, open as he was of mind and spirit, eventually made multiple trips to our house to survey the situation. Bill McCarthy also came, unfortunately, when there were a lot of mosquitoes. Sorry about that. And they were gauging what the possibilities were. How would they manage the challenges of this tree with its low hanging branches and thin shoots, and somehow manage the expectations of a 10-year-old dreamer? How was this house to be what she might imagine it to be? A place of her own, away from her brother, nestled in nature in a favorite spot, a place where she could read and think and imagine and feel safe at home in the fold of God's branches. And I have to admit that I was having a hard time imagining a structure that could fit this space. And I've known that I would feel no hard feelings to Mr. Allen if he just scrapped the whole thing and said, "I'm so sorry." Just like I hold no judgment if you at your table designs had to stop at some point with the limitations of what you had to work with. I see the poor folks with the magnet tiles over here and how they collapse on each other and they get the thumbs down from the building constructors. And I see the people here with the Legos who had twice as many pieces and 3 times as many pieces as everybody else building together a little working building with the tires. And I see the big Duplos and I see the energy that you have brought to what you have. But there's no judgment here about what you were able to make or not make with what you were handed with no expectations. Friends, how idyllic it sounds to feel safe at home in the branches of a tree, or even the tables that we hold here, or the circle we fold in on Zoom. But we are acknowledging that this is a tough time, as we are truthful about as we look around us. 2 weeks and change out from a national election, and there is ongoing fear about how the legislative, executive, and judicial branches can hold up a representative democracy. And while it's often difficult to talk politics here in worship, I don't believe that we can ignore what's going on around us and what affects so much of our lives as residents of this country. We are unable to distance ourselves and deny that the outcome of the presidential race has a sizable impact on the psyche and the climate of life around us. That is true of life here in Columbia and true of where some of the people online are living in Arizona and Florida and elsewhere. What an opportunity then, as our commitment weekend arrives November 1st through 3rd, just days prior to the election, on that following Tuesday, to be in a particular posture of inquiry and prayer. While many are tired and skeptical about our government's ability to function well, no matter who is in office, we know that if we remove ourselves from caring about all things political, that we leave room for oppressive leadership, and for a home that further excludes the vulnerable and profits the powerful, a home that doesn't learn from its lessons in history. And so we ask just where our emotions are and how we can use them constructively to work on a different kind of building. This past week, Black theologian Dr. Barbara A. Holmes passed away after a time of illness. Dr. Holmes worked with Father Richard Rohr at the Center for Action and Contemplation, and over her years as a professor, seminary president, and contemplative, she equipped others to face crises and draw upon the wisdom of the Spirit for our time. Dr. Holmes wrote of our historical moment: "During these times of deep division and unnecessary harm to the vulnerable, the anger of decent people everywhere is appropriate. Public and peaceful expression of that anger is a first step to creating safe boundaries." Safe boundaries. A few moments ago, you were indeed asked to build something from the materials you had on hand. At home, it was etchings with paper or whatever you could put together in those moments that you had together. We hope that as a house that we build anytime we go to make a structure, that we want to make it secure, and often with the walls, we want to provide sturdy shelter. But we hear the contrast in King David's story today as Jerry brought it forth, and it was sandwiched by this desire to get working and building. Although the desire is to build a house for God with the materials he has access to, it isn't what God has in mind. We can also hear the voices of the writers and editors, as we believe many were going back into this narrative story over time, trying to make the whole history of Israel make sense. And they go back to King David's story, and they're trying to explain a little bit about the fact about why David didn't build God's temple. Trying to explain why it is that Solomon gets that pleasure later. And the history that is shared is something that might be seen as a weakness on David's part for not having taken that step. But in retrospect, we're able to see it as faithfulness. This is thanks to the voice of Nathan, the guide and the prophet who's in this journey. This is the first time we see him, at first ready to go along with David, as you hear it. After all, David is known as the one who is after God's own heart, telling David what he likely wants to hear, that they should probably draw up the blueprints. But then, thanks to what we can assume is a night encounter with the Almighty, reverses his counsel, Nathan does. And I believe it is Nathan's intervention that prevents David from domesticating God. And it also helps keep the people in history from deifying David. Even with all his success at consolidating power and fighting wars, David requires checks on his conscience and on his power. Nathan is needed now, and as we will see later, Nathan is needed then. Bathsheba. With my pre-election ears, this is what I hear that aligns with my own experience, and I wonder if it aligns with yours too. There need to be Nathans, the ones who are able to speak truth to the one in power, political and otherwise. To me, the most remarkable part of this passage is that we are told that David actually allows and listens to Nathan's counsel. David receives the word and then prays God's favor in the next chapter. David accepts that his legacy will not be a palace for God. It will be an enduring people for God, made up of those who are ever imperfectly attempting to put trust in human leaders, made up of a people quite naturally who will yearn for safety and security. Hear this precedent. A brave voice offers a dissenting opinion to the most powerful leader, and the leader hears the godly wisdom in it, offers thanksgiving for the turn, and moves forward accordingly. As we have witnessed the window of public discourse divide and narrow in our news, we wonder about the role of protest and the voices that are in the wilderness calling out. When we lose the power to voice dissent and to hear conflicting opinions, it is increasingly likely that the Nathans are written off and written out of history. And then the voice of God is lost to hubris. We can so long for a sense of safety that we relinquish collective power to someone who promises something beyond what is in their power to give. Friends, in a time when many are feeling politically homeless, we hear voices like those of Rabbi Sharon Brous of the Ikar community in Los Angeles. In her Yom Kippur sharing this past week, she addressed her still grieving congregation with urgency. Our most urgent work today is to protect this country from the threat of authoritarianism. And it is in the spirit of learning from those who are speaking out truths that a group of interfaith leaders that are planning the courageous conversations in our county for a countrywide event at the beginning of this next year, we've been coming together over the last month. We are reading Rabbi Brous's book, The Amen Effect. This is one that Mary Brandenburg had introduced a little bit to us in August. In this book, the rabbi outlines the need for mending in our divided time and space. She encourages ritual and spiritual practice to come alongside those who are in pain, and she helps us to ask what role religion has to play in helping to foster an empathic society. This is something we deeply need in a county and country where the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism has risen, and our neighbors, I've heard from them, many of them feel less safe and less secure. As elections roll around, we ask whether we live in this house, the United States, as a structure that is equipped to honor the dreams of its diverse citizenry and the huddled masses who would seek these shores fleeing violence. We ask whether we have addressed our national legacies of terrorism and supremacy or have denied them. We ask whether the colonizers of our country were so wrapped up in housemaking that they failed consistently to consult the midnight air, to hear the soulful wind of the trees and the call of the snowy owl. They did not leave plenty good room for Nathan to hear the second word of the nighttime council. A survey of history illustrates that there is no physical space that is not vulnerable to the realities of human warring. The house of David found this so through generations of divisions and diaspora. And the nations in the Holy Land tragically today find it is so too. The United States finds it is so here in our own warring and our own dubious dealings around the world. So now, at election time, again, as it rolls around, dare we to hear from our inner Nathan, the part that speaks truth to our soul. God's place is no one place. God's place is every place. The sturdiest of branches and most pitiful pile of Legos we can muster. And we long for and invite our leaders to listen. And we are called to be a community who builds leaders from our shared life with integrity. And we act in love as if each soul houses the image of God. Our prayer in the National Night of the Soul that we sit in is to act big and small in ways that will change our own course from acquiescence to speaking uncomfortable truth. We may trust the power that is checked has the opportunity to yield something greater than what any one head of state can envision. Friends, I'm so grateful that Mr. Allen stuck with it. He worked to envision the kind of treehouse Phoebe might want, but she worked with materials that were beyond her own expectation. It wasn't a matter of the skill or know-how that he brought, but a new vision struck 1 week not long ago. He was inspired when he heard of suspended tree houses made not out of wood but of rope, creating floors that you could see through and feel the tension like you do on ropes courses. And so he got to work helping to build a house for Phoebe that she had not envisioned for herself. One that you can see through, one that stretches, one that holds the integrity of the host tree, one that molds itself to whomever shimmies their way up its slender branches. And it's true, you can't really call it a tree house in the traditional sense. But Phoebe's book nook, installed yesterday, seems just the right place for a current and future leader of truth and grace to gain her wisdom.